Hi, welcome to Cafe to Do Night. Today we're very happy and honored to have Dr. Mary Pipher. Dr. Mary Pipher is a clinical psychologist, a New York Times best-selling author, but most importantly, she's a social activist who aims to help our environment and culture. She is really a cultural therapist, a symbol of compassion in action. Hello, Dr. Pipher.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here with you today, Peter. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really happy to meet you because I think I myself am a psychologist, but you're such a role model for all of us because you're not only helping individuals, but you also aim to help a group of people. You aim to help our culture. Did you ever dream to be someone like this? How did you start to become interested in all your activities that you're involved in right now?
You know, even as a young girl, I was very interested in being helpful. I was the big sister, and my parents were gone a great deal. So I spent a lot of time taking care of children. I was extremely fond of animals, spent a lot of time taking care of animals. I'd go out after a storm and look for animals that need rescue and bring them home and feed them and take care of them. So that was part of my personality from when I was very young. And then by the time I was a little older, I just noticed that a great many people confided in me. I was somebody people like to tell their situations to. And I found that very interesting. I was interested in people's feelings. I remember one time when I was in high school, that the teenage girls that were my friends were talking about their prom dresses and describing them and so on. And I remember all I cared about was how did they feel about their prom dresses. I just had I was interested in how people thought and felt and behaved. But I actually didn't even know about psychology in my small high school. I studied anthropology because I was very interested in how people all over the world acted. I was interested in how different cultures affected the way people developed as individuals. So when I finished school at Berkeley, I wanted to continue in anthropology, but I was broke and I was accepted to school, but without finance.
I see.
I couldn't afford to go. But later, I came to Nebraska and was looking into schooling here, graduate school. And it turned out at that point, NIMH was offering a free ride, all expenses paid for
Wow.
graduate students in clinical,
Wow.
because they needed clinical psychologists in this country. This was 72. So I got into a free 5-year Ph.D. program. At that point, I had never taken a psychology course. I took a couple courses over the summer. And then when I was in psychology, I found myself most interested in the same topic I'd been interested in anthropology, which was how does culture affect people? And when clients come in and talk about issues, what impact does a culture play on the problems they're having? So it was a kind of a natural segue for me. And I loved being a therapist. I just loved it. I'm interested in people. I love to ask people the question, what is your experience? What is your point of view? And listen. So I was so happy to have found therapy as my life profession.
You're such a natural. You start out as a helpful girl, helping people and animals, and then you study anthropology, which is quite interesting because that itself is an interesting field. But then from anthropology to clinical psychology must be a real, I guess there's always that connection of helping someone, but also looking at problem from a bigger scale. Reminded me of Karen Horney, who don't just focus on unconscious conflict, but also focus on social issues.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was very fortuitous that I was able to study anthro and then psychology, and really both almost by accident. I wasn't planning a life at that point. I was moving where I was interested and where there was opportunity. But you know, Peter, I grew up in a world very different than most children grow up in today. And it was a world where My grandmother, for example, said to me every time we were together, your job is to help people.
Mm.
And I was very much taught that it was important to be a good girl. It was very important to be a good girl. And I'm not sure children are taught the same way. And I just ended up thinking, well, that's the way a person should be, you know. So, and it's very rewarding life.
I think the way you grew up are probably so different than the kids grew up today. I mean, you wrote a lot of your books are also helping the girls and women. And I think one of the challenge for girls today is the social media. What do you think about, that's a very cultural issue. What do you think about this issue?
I just realized lately, now you're quite a bit younger than me, I believe, but my generation is the only generation and will always be the only generation in the world that lived utterly pre-social media and utterly post-social media. So we have seen over the course of our lives the great divide. In fact, I grew up without television. Television came into my life quite late. So I grew up in a world where entertainment was other people or the natural world or books. And mostly people sat on front porches and talked to each other or went to little cafes or had potlucks in church basements. And I liked all that. I think people are lonelier now because they have so much less opportunity to be with their neighbors, be with their friends, be outside on their porches at night visiting and watching children play. Children aren't playing outside very much anymore. They're inside in home entertainment stations. Social media is something many people can talk to you about. We just rewrote or redid Reviving Ophelia, my daughter and I, 25th year anniversary.
Right.
And sent out the old book published in 94 to girls all over the country and said, go through this book, cross out everything that's no longer relevant or interesting to you, and instead write all over the book what you really want to hear about. And of course, girls wanted to hear about social media. They said that is an enormous change. It's changed everything we wrote about girls. So we really looked into it for that book. And here's just one interesting statistic. In 94, girls were in pretty bad shape. They had high rates of delinquency, early pregnancy, drug and alcohol use, arrests, suicide attempts, just a lot of indications that they weren't doing very well. And that's primarily at that time, I think it was because of an advertising culture and a culture that was not attending girls, a somewhat misogynistic culture that was not attending the needs of girls. Well, girls after my book, and it wasn't just because of my book. I mean, there was Kara Gilligan, there were some very good studies about girls that came out around the same time I wrote. But because of a new set of educational materials about girls, the consciousness and the culture changed quite rapidly. Girls started almost immediately doing better. And the peak of girls' health was 2007. That's the year the cell phone was invented.
Right.
Since then, it's gone down.
Wow.
Because even with cell phones, girls started texting. I went over to visit with a group of girls probably in about 2010. And I asked these girls, how many times do you text someone a day? They said 300 or 400. I couldn't believe it. It was just beyond my imagination that you would be on a phone texting 300 or 400 times a day. But that's when I realized the situation for girls was so different.
Yeah.
I think they're much more isolated now. The average girl on Saturday night is in her room alone with her phone watching Netflix by herself.
Yeah.
When I was a teenage girl, I was at a slumber party. I was always out with my friends.
Yeah.
On the positive side, because girls are spending most of their time at home on their devices, they aren't getting in nearly as much trouble. aren't having as much trouble with their parents because they are not breaking rules. They're at home.
Right.
And they're getting along much better with their parents. On the negative side, they're much more anxious, much more anxious. Not only because of social media, but because of school shootings, because of academic pressure, and because they aren't having experiences necessary to move through the developmental stages into maturity. They're home. They're home. They're not out working. They're not out interacting with people. They're not out navigating the world on their own the way children used to do. So they're just less confident about and they're less skilled in terms of taking on the world.
They definitely grew up very different than you. I was listening to your memoir a little bit. When you grew up, I guess, in an environment where you can go out, play games all day in the nature, playing with the animals. I have a little taste of that in my childhood where I would live near the ocean side, and then we all just go out, hang out. No one knows where you are, and you come home, no one knows where you went.
All that freedom was lovely for children, and they don't have that now. And with that freedom, Peter, we learned to take care of ourselves, didn't we? We learned to navigate the world. We learned to pack our own peanut butter sandwich and head out. And it was a good experience. We talked and interacted with people on our own without our parents' side.
Right. So I think your experience of being independent also helped you to understand some of people's struggles, such as, I guess, refugee and immigrants, where they have to leave home, go to a different country to be on their own. I think, can you say a little bit about how not only you're helping girls, but you're also helping the refugees? Because this is, I found your topic are very relevant to even right now, today. We have so many refugees and immigrants that's like rushing into United States.
Right. Well, I went to college. I started college in 1965, which was really the peak of the civil rights movement in the Midwest. And almost as soon as I started at University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, they were marching in Kansas City and integrating lunch counters. And I got involved in that. And I was very active through college in civil rights and very interested in helping people who were disenfranchised. I also did a project in San Francisco. There was a large hotel that had housed Filipino men who had come here to work, but because of the exclusion laws, had not been allowed to bring their wives or have children. So by now, these men were very old, and the city was tearing down the hotel. And I was an anthro student sent in from Berkeley to talk to these men and help them relocate. And that particular experience opened my heart to the problems of refugees. And these particular men, immigrants, I would say, not refugees, these particular men had been so left out of mainstream culture and so abandoned when they stopped being useful in terms of working on railroads or whatever. Mostly what I did was have a family and work as a clinical psychologist in private practice. I did some teaching, some consulting. But in I think it was about 1987, a wave of Vietnamese came to Lincoln. And a psychologist I know, opened the first Vietnamese cultural center. And I went to work there. I was just interested. It's the anthropologist in me. I just wanted to learn about people from all over the world. I live in the middle of the country in it used to be a pretty homogenous community. Now in Lincoln, we have 80 languages in our schools. It's not, it's very beautiful, diverse community. But I started there, and then about 99, we were designated a refugee resettlement community, and people started coming in from all over the world. But particularly they were coming in from the Middle East, from the Iraq wars. And I started seeing women in burqas on the street, and became very interested in working with the newcomers. So that's when I did my major. I wrote a book called The Middle of Everywhere about all the newcomers coming into town. And I did a lot of work. I did a lot of work at that point with newcomers from Africa, from Kurdish, Yazidi people came in at some point. And now I'm working with Afghans. This last couple of years, I've had we've helped sponsor 2 Afghan families.
Wow.
Bring them to America. So that work to me is not, it's not a chore, it's not a sacrifice, it's profoundly interesting. And as you may know, refugees are often the most resilient of people.
Yeah.
And the people I'm meeting through this are smart and interesting and kind and eager to succeed in America. So they're very easy to help, very easy to help.
Well, what do you think is the most challenging thing they have to face, and how did you help them, the immigrants and the refugees?
Well, of course, immediately what they have to face are issues around getting a car, learning to drive, getting licensed, because there's very few jobs in our town that you can have without a car. The children move into school systems. And Peter, that is just amazing. We have one of the Afghan girls is very smart. She came here last April, speaking no English. And I visited her around Christmas, and she was reading me books in English. I mean, there's some amazing, beautiful things with children. But ultimately, what the refugees have to face is the broken immigration system. And so, for example, the Afghans are almost all here on humanitarian parole. Well, that's a short-term visa. And depending on who our next president is, depending on policy changes, they have no legal way to stay in America. So there's so many difficulties for people trying to actually become citizens, become part of the American society. Language, of course. Children pick it up very quickly. Older people have more trouble.
But I think one of the best way, not just the psychologists, but all of us, what we can do for these newcomers is to be practical, like help them to get the everyday challenges done. And because I think if you cannot take care of the basics, forget about mental health, like these are some of the fundamentals, right? How to read, how to drive, how to maneuver in the system, but also and then also be a good listener to their struggles and sort of help them to bring out the resiliency that they already have.
You know, most refugees do not want therapy, even if they've been very traumatized. They want a job. They want to go to school. They want to find a swimming pool for the kids, or they need warm coats for winter. And furthermore, many refugees and immigrants come from cultures where there's no cultural analog for therapy. So for them, it seems almost like torture to go into a room and sit down and talk to a stranger. And especially from their perspective, the stranger does nothing to help them. All they do is listen to their problems. And it's like, I remember one time early on, I was trying to do therapy with a refugee. And she wanted a prescription. And I, listened to her talk about how hard it was to get this prescription. And I said, well, I could make a call about this prescription, but I doubt if I would have any more power than the doctor to help you with this.
All right.
And she said, well, what am I here for? If you can't help me get what I need, why am I talking to you? And that has been kind of my experience, that we psychologists often are eager to help and jump in. But the model I ended up using with the refugees I worked with was called the healing package, where I asked them, what are the things you need to feel better? And a lot of times they would say, we need a place to bury our dead. We need a place to have a commemoration for the people that died that we weren't able to bury in our. Or we need a cow and a place to roast it with our own people, so we can have a feast and be together and talk about America. Or we need a swimming pool pass. These were the or we need transportation the first few weeks
Yeah.
of a new job until we can arrange for another kind of transportation, or we need to learn the bus routes.
Mhm.
These were the kind of things. And I used the phrase cultural broker to mean be the person who connects newcomers with American systems. So the first time a person goes to a dentist or a doctor or a school or a job application or health and human services for their interviews there and health checkups, go with them and kind of help them feel comfortable. I remember taking a woman to an MRI. And I tried to explain to her what this MRI would be like, but she had absolutely no idea what it meant. And so I wanted to go in with her to the MRI and just kind of show her I could lie down in it and kind of talk to her a little more. The person doing this wouldn't let me do that. And so she went in alone. And a few minutes later, she came running out, so terrified, because just the whole idea of having someone put you in a machine and tell you not to move and then start hammering above your head was just beyond her capacities to understand or handle.
Yeah, this is such a wonderful way of describing what you do for them, the healing package. And this is something we all could do for the newcomer. And
Absolutely.
we could be there, we could accompany them. This reminds me, at one point I was doing some disaster mental health work where I would visit a disaster site and try to provide some mental health help. But if you just sit there putting a sign mental health, no one's gonna come to you for sure. So what I found, what's more helpful is you just walk around and you find ways to chit chat with. And so I also do photo journals. So I would say, hey, you want to take a photo? And then I would use that as a chance to see, hey, what do you need? Oh, you need water, you need blanket. And I think that's probably a better way to be practical and helpful, and instead of try to psychoanalyze them on
That's
the couch.
right. That's right. Well, and that was a very good way to do it, because I'm sure you met lots of people who had needs that you, being a more sophisticated American, could be a benefit to them.
Sure, yeah. And so we kind of have to open our eyes to see what the person really needs at that moment and be practical. I remember the way you say you do your therapy is very down to earth and practical. How do you combine your anthropology knowledge with your psychotherapy training when you help a client of yours? What do you pay attention to when you help people deal with their mental health?
Well, first of all, I think the space between two people when they're having a conversation in a therapy room is sacred space. It's an incredible honor to be asked to listen to someone's deepest troubles and to be able to be of service to them with a comment or advice. And so the first thing I work on, the most important thing, is attunement, and being with someone in a way they feel listened to, they feel heard, they feel as if I am making a genuine effort with my heart and my mind to understand them. That is my primary early focus. And then my first question always to people is, I'm interested in what brought you. Very simple question. And then, depending on what they say, mostly what I'm doing is asking questions the first session and maybe for the rest of the sessions. But what I'm actually listening for, when I'm working with people, I'm not listening for the problems. I'm listening for the solutions and the ways in which I might hear what the person is saying and somehow leverage that into a new way of thinking, into a more hopeful and skillful way of dealing with this problem. So it could be a very small thing the person says, but that particular small thing, for example, they could say in the midst of talking about how unhappy they are in their marriage, they could say something very simple like, thank God I get to go out to dinner once a week with my sister.
Mm-hmm.
I might say at the end, it's clear you have the capacity to have a beautiful relationship. You have one with your sister. And I'm so glad you do, because you need someone like that in your life right now that you can share your thoughts and feelings with. And I wonder, when you think about your relationship with your sister, are there any elements of that relationship that you might want to try to introduce to your marriage?
Mm-hmm.
Just a very small question like that. But mostly I'm listening for solutions. I believe that when people leave a therapy session, they should leave feeling hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
They should leave with some kind of plan to make their lives a little bit better. And they should leave feeling that they've received empathy and understanding.
Mm-hmm. That's a very nice way of putting your approach together. I mean, I think what people need the most sometimes is first start out by feeling understood, right? Like people need to feel understood. Like if they don't feel understood, whatever solution you have for them is probably not gonna matter as much. Like, and then once they feel you understood them, then they welcome you to see things a little bit differently.
That's right. And, one of the things now, there's a lot of online therapy. There's a lot of therapy advertised as, call this number. If you don't like this therapist, we'll get you another therapist, and so on. And the relationship is the most powerful part of therapy. Furthermore, in terms of understanding the person, it's actually really essential to understand the person before you can help them. I'm not a cookie cutter person at all. I mean, I know there's obviously some protocols for treating OCD or and so on, but really the genuine work from my point of view comes down to having a strong sense of the person's resources, their limitations, their hopes and goals for themselves, their support systems, the metaphors they use in talking about their own lives, the conceptual schema they work with in trying to make decisions. And unless you know those kind of things, the advice you give people is not likely to be all that helpful to them.
Right. Makes a lot of sense to me. And I think one of the beauty of working as a therapist is also that when we're helping others, or when we are listening to others deeply, we also need to, or sometimes indirectly, we listen to ourselves in some way.
Yes.
And we
Absolutely.
gain some wisdom for our own
Absolutely.
issues while helping the other person.
That's so good. Well, and also listening to ourselves, we gain some wisdom in terms of how to go on in the session. For example, if I find myself bored in a session, what that signal means to me is I'm not working hard. That it's my job to keep the conversation at an intensity and at a depth that is interesting.
Yeah.
And if it's interesting to me, it's because the client is actually thinking and moving forward. Also, when I just feel an overwhelming amount of sympathy for someone, a lot of times I know very well that sympathy comes from my own experience and my own sense that something like this has happened to me. And I watch very carefully that I don't confuse my life with the life of that client.
That's such a wonderful way of teaching the young therapist how to be a good therapist, is like listening to the person, but also pay attention to our emotional reaction, because our emotional reaction give us also signals on how the relationship should go. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it together. I guess I'm just, your most recent book is it's a memoir, and I'm just like curious about how did you come up with that title?
The Life and Light. Yeah. Well, light, of course, in the book is both a physical light, but it's also metaphorical light.
Right.
And it has to do with resilience. My own experience has been that my life is filled with both sparkle and shadow. Some very rough things have happened over the course of my life, and then, of course, many beautiful things. I don't think the trick of life is being lucky or even being, just sort of constantly having things go well. I think the trick of light is to have a life like almost all of us have, that as mixed up as salt and pepper in terms of light and darkness, but to be able to find a path forward in light. And I love light. It's my first memory. When I was a baby, I remember looking up through trees at the dappled light and just being fascinated by it. I didn't have any words for that. I really probably didn't even know what a tree was. I just noticed the sparkling light. I remember to this day, it was so powerful to me. And the first story in A Light of Light, A Light in Life is I go to, my father's over in the Korean War, my mother's in med school. She takes my two little brothers and me on a drive on Saturday night. We don't have much money. We end up sitting in front of a radio station that has a fountain. And this fountain has a color wheel so that the water changes color, blue to yellow and so on.
Yeah.
And my mother fell asleep at the wheel. She was so exhausted. My brothers jumped out of the car and wrestled around in the grass. And I just looked at that beautiful color wheel. And I found that light and beauty were very dependable sources for me of happiness and calming down. So the book has a lot of stories where I'm struggling with something. I may be in a fix, pretty bad fix in some cases. And somehow I find both literal and figurative light and I'm able to move on.
I love the metaphor of light and darkness. And I think sometimes we found the brightest light in the deepest darkness,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's so necessary. It's so necessary to find the brightest light.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something I found out when I interviewed women for Women Roaring North. And generally, we kind of have a prejudice that the people who have the luckiest lives are the happiest and the most grateful. It turns out that's actually not true, because that the luckier and more privileged you are in general, the more complexity your life has. And also the more things you expect to go very well. And of course, in nobody's life does everything go very well on a regular basis. And so the person I found interviewing, I didn't even know, over 100 women for the book, that was the happiest and the most grateful, was a woman who was very, very poor, had been poor all of her life. And what she had learned quite early was that gratitude was a survival skill. She was grateful for everything. And that humor was a survival. And she laughed and joked around more than any of the women I interviewed who had much more privileged positions. So I think that in the darkness, we're most likely to really rocket toward life, because we need it so very much. It's a balancing thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you have this much darkness in your life, you really need to have this much light to maintain equilibrium.
Yeah, make a lot of sense. Sometimes when I think that life is like a film or like a movie, it would be a very bad film to watch if everything goes so okay. That would be the most boring film to watch if everything's so nice and cozy.
Well, and if you notice music, CDs, they just have a sad song, then a happy song, then a sad song, then a happy song. And I think that's probably an attempt to in a sense, mimic the way all of our lives go. We're out dancing rock and roll, and then we're brokenhearted.
I think, yeah, and Buddha's first teaching is that life has difficulty, life has dukkha, unsatisfactoriness to it. It's funny. I read one of your. I mean, not. I realized you wrote a book on "You're the Worst Buddhist in the World." That is such a fun title. Has that humor in you? How did you come up with that title to start with?
Well, actually, my husband came up with it because I started meditating in 2002.
Okay.
I'd been out on the road at that point for 16 years nonstop, speaking, selling books, book tours. I had 1 year I spent more than half my nights in hotel rooms.
Oh, wow.
I was getting very tired of it, very afraid. And this was just after 9/11. And I'd written a book that was essentially a love song to refugees and diversity. And right after 9/11, nobody wanted to read it. So to respect my publishers, to try to help them sell that book, I agreed to a much heavier schedule than usual of book promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point during that year, I just melted down. I just was so done. And I needed to go home. I needed to go home. So I did come home. And it was very interesting. I came home in November. I didn't go out to work again till much later. And by then I rescheduled my schedule, so it wasn't so arduous. But when I came home, I was pretty broken in a very polite way. I mean, nobody knew I was broken except my husband. But I lay in front of my fire and read history books. I like history and the perspective. And I patted my cat, drank tea, and I started reading psychology to try to understand my situation.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did that, I usually felt worse about myself. I'd give myself a new label, that I was depressed or ruminative or whatever.
Right.
And I was somehow different from other people. And then I started reading Buddhism. And it had the opposite effect on me. I realized I am just a human being like everyone else. And my suffering is no different than the suffering of all other people. And I started to feel connected to people. I started to feel that what I needed to move from where I was to a better place was a set of skills. I wasn't trapped in some sort of personality that could not change. And so that's when I joined the Buddhist Sangha and started reading a lot of Buddhism, meditating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been tremendously important to me. I'm still in the same Sangha I started 22 years ago. So we've become a very beloved community. And now when I'm undergoing hard times, the breathing, the different skills I've learned for being non-reactive, for examining myself, these have been very helpful. One regret I have, Peter, is that I didn't have these skills when I was a therapist. I think I could have been more helpful to people if I had had, 22 years of practice with Buddhism.
But I think your personal philosophy and values are not different from the Buddhist tradition. Even you only met Buddhism much later on in your life. I think the heart, the value of Buddhist practice is not so much like sitting there floating in the air and having a good time, but really what you're doing is really about service, compassion in action. And I think you have been doing that even before you encounter Buddhist practice. So that's why I thought it's very funny when you say your husband named you the
Oh, I want to get back to that. So anyway, when I was first meditating, I was still pretty much a nervous wreck. And so he came in one day and I had NPR on and I was talking on the phone and I was trying to pay some bills. And I was just like, just crazy, busy and irritable. And he was kind of mad too. And he goes, "You are the worst Buddhist in the world." And I thought, he's probably right. I don't think I'm a very good Buddhist. And we all have that moment when we feel like we're the worst Buddhist in the world, that we aren't doing any of the things we want to do and we're forgetting to breathe and so on and so on. But I thought, well, that's really At first, I was kind of hurt by it. And then I thought, well, this has the potential to be a very funny book title.
Yeah. By the way, that's a common thing we say to each other in the Buddhist family anyway. So
You're the worst Buddhist in the world.
right,
That's
like
good.
that's like when you're like a Buddhist family member, you're like, yeah, that's very not Buddhist. We use that all the time. It's a common thing. It's a common thing. But it's great that you point this out that but I think also that in Buddhism we were taught that even when you're at your worst, you still could be it could still be a teaching moment for other people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Such a wonderful conversation with you. I learned so much just from this short conversation. What do you think is the take-home message you want our audience to have based on what we just talked about?
Well, first of all, I think both for therapists and for ordinary citizens, students who might hear this tape, I want to emphasize that social engagement, activism, caring for other people, working for the environment, just walking across a street or downtown and having the intention to be kind to people. It's not only about being a good person, it's about one's own mental health. The world is a pretty dark place right now. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of frightening things to deal with. And my own experience is the antidote to despair is action. And that if you can be of use to someone, that helps your own mental health. It gives you a sense of agency in a world where it's very hard to feel agency. So, for example, when I'm really down, one of the devices I use to perk myself up is I'll think, is there anyone in the world who would like to hear from me? Mm-hmm. Is there someone that if I called them up on the phone, it would make them happy? And I can always think of someone like that. So I urge people who listen to this tape to consider the idea of being more engaged with people at whatever level that's possible and to enjoy the fruits of community service.
That's such a wonderful way to conclude your conversation with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
It's really a personal honor to talk to you. You're such a wonderful role model for all psychologists. And I hope you enjoy our conversation with Dr. Pipher. Do remember to check out Dr. Pipher's books. She has 10 books. Many of them are New York Times best-selling books, so do read them. And she has so much wisdom with her. Be helpful to yourself, be helpful to your neighbor, be helpful to the society. Every month, third Friday, 7 p.m., stay tuned.